It is my distinct pleasure, me being John Tamny, to be talking to Professor Stephen Hicks today. I can't say we go way back, but we go back about 2 years. I met you at a Liberty Fund event down in Jekyll Island.
Yes.
And it was so much fun getting to know you and talking about the ideas of liberty. Interesting at the time is that very much on the minds of the people there, because the subject was envy and the shame of envy, the question was one of creeping socialism and whether that was coming to the United States. And so I think that's probably the best place to jump off. What's your sense of that? Do you buy into this idea that socialism is getting its day in the sun?
Well, it is, and the hard question is whether it's real socialism, particularly among the younger people, who I think are the most important demographic, or whether it's more of a disgust at cronyism as they see it, or uncertainties about the economy, right, or some sense that they aren't going to get the kind of American dream in their generation that has been promised before, and maybe there could be some elements of envy there as well. But I think it is getting its moment in the sun. I'm not at all an expert on day-to-day politics, and this is the year of the Democratic presidential primary. And clearly some candidates who've drunk deeply at the well of socialism are prominent. So yeah, it is. It is.
Well, because here's what I keep running into, and you can comment more knowledgeably than I can. Two things about college campuses. The first thing that I'm always reminded of is back in the 1960s, Berkeley was the flower bed of radicalism in the United States. Yet when they actually dug down into the student population, it was basically 5% of the population. The rest were fairly normal. It was the 5% fringe that stood out.
Yeah.
And then I look at college campuses. Whenever I speak at them, I always ask the kids where they're going. And these alleged socialists always say they're going to New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, almost without fail, which means they're going to the three most ruthlessly capitalist industries on earth to make their mark. And so I kind of feel like there's a watch what they do, not what they say. But have I lost it here? Or?
Well, no, I think your first point about the demographics is interesting, because it always is a minority that makes movements. And it's the minorities who have the most consistent principles that they are articulating, and they have some sense that they should step forward with those principles. And people who are principled in their approach and who step forward, I think that's always going to be a minority. But I think that's the general point, that almost always history is made by minorities. So the fact then that we have in our generation, I don't know how socialist they are, young people. There's a significant number of them, but there are many of them who are less interested in socialism as you and I might think about it, as an economic system, and various other forms of cultural politics. And they will have overlaps with socialism. Socialism is an authoritarian, centralized, kind of adversarial, initially, economic policy. It's us versus the capitalists, and we see the capitalists as unjust and ruthless oppressors and so forth. And so, in some sense, all's fair in the economic battle, according to the socialists, as they shade into revolutionary. But I don't know that economic matters are front and center for this generation of people on the left. It's race issues, gender issues, ethnic issues, even battles over history, the legacy of slavery, and so on. And those aren't necessarily primarily economic. So it's a minority of people who have been well schooled in a kind of left adversarial politics, but economics is just one element in the mix for them.
Do you ever sense that maybe some of this is history repeating itself, and not in the World War II or post-World War II socialist sense that we know? But I look back on history, and Jimmy Carter, someone we're both old enough to remember, was giving those speeches talking about how Americans needed to basically reset their ambitions, their expectations, that they're going to have to accept lives of reduced living standards. And he couldn't have been more incorrect. And I feel like this was said under Carter. I got out of college in the early 1990s, and they made movies about my generation, Slacker, Reality Bites. There's the Generation X book, about how these kids were going to live with their parents forever. And then that generation created the internet boom and became extraordinarily rich. I just feel like we keep hearing this about how young kids are going to get less, and then they become the richest generation in the history yet.
Yeah, well, I'm an optimist. I think we're on the same page there as well. Now, I was growing up in Canada and I was a kid when Carter was president, so I was only vaguely aware of what was going on with him there. But when I see us repeating history, I do think I want to go back before World War II, because it seems right now the political landscape is a resurgence of not only kind of liberal democratic, Republican, free market type people versus some sort of authoritarian communism, but we do have a more ethnically based authoritarian resurgence. And it's not only in the United States. There is a resurgence of socialism or collectivism combined in a nationalistic lens. And I think that is one of the big stories of this last generation. So we do have people coming out of the left, and we do have a resurgent kind of, we call them the alt-right, but really the alt-right starts to look a lot like the 19-teens and the 1920s in Europe. And in many cases, it's hard to tell the difference between the more authoritarian strains of the left and the authoritarian alt-rightists. So they do seem to be a merger there. Now, it's interesting because the fascist right, if we can use that language now, I know it's tricky. How you divide up the spectrum, but the far right or the authoritarian right went out of favor after World War II for obviously good reasons. But they're coming back, and this is the repeating history that I would be more likely to focus on as more disturbing than just the pessimists about we're not going to be able to increase the living standard economically.
Well, so on that, you came up in Canada, and you're in the United States, and I'm reminded of something that someone you probably know, Sally Pipes. She's another Canadian who moved to the U.S. to, among other things, she runs a Pacific Research Institute now. And her mom said to her when she left, Sally, do not become one of those impatient Americans. And Americans have this reputation around the world. They don't like lines. They want things now, and we are different. We're the crazies. We descend from somewhere else. We left somewhere. Does that, in and of itself, give you optimism? Does your story of moving to the U.S. give you optimism? And then Americans just are congenitally not collectivist. They're individualistic, I think. They want things. Is there any hope based? Is that part of your optimism?
Well, yeah, I think it is. The United States is still, for very good reasons, a beacon around the world for many positive attitudes. The entrepreneurism, the generosity, the sense that all problems can be solved, and the get things done right attitude. I don't know that the cultural differences between Canadians and Americans are that strong. At least when I was growing up, Canadians were kind of halfway between British Reserve and American go-getterism, and I think Canadians are becoming more like Americans as, particularly American pop culture is dominant. So I do think, yes, the American sense of life and the American stereotypical attitudes are still very strong in a large number of the population. The thing that I worry about, though, is the same sorts of things that you're talking about when you go to college campuses. The college campuses are they're meant to be hotbeds and laboratories and experiments. That's what we want universities to be tryout places. And so we can't expect a certain number of crazy ideas are going to be experimented with when people are in college. But there has been a generation shift among the intellectuals, and we do see it seeping out into law, into education, and the other professions. So that's the thing that I would worry about, whether this generation is in fact different.
Yeah, because even there, it's just you look back in history, and there was a pamphlet that came out saying about America's young people not too long ago at this point, saying that communism would not work in the United States because America's younger generation was so lazy and self-focused that they could never work for others, let alone themselves. And what's fascinating about this, of course, is that this was written by Elbert Hubbard in 1898. And so it strikes me, and again, maybe this is why I'm optimistic, and I sense you. They always say this about young people. And it strikes me that this is progress in a way, in some weird, maybe paradoxical way, that every generation has it so much better than the previous one, that they look lazier, that they maybe look more entitled, they look more expecting of these things, but they don't end up turning out that way, because based on this, it seems that people have been predicting doom, at least here, for quite some time, at least going back to the 19th century.
Yeah. Well, I don't think there's any necessity one way or the other. The fact that every generation we've improved standard of living, that doesn't predict that next generation we're going to do it. It also doesn't predict that we're not going to do it. I think human beings, they make choices, and they make choices when they're young people about what their philosophy of life is going to be, and that's what they live. So we do have, a generation that's raised in relative comfort. I think a large number of people recognize that they have opportunities, they've got the material resources available to them. The question is going to be what their philosophy of life is. Do they take those riches and the resources and opt for a life of leisure, in which case they don't become productive, they then just start to let it slide? Do they come to believe, as some of our influential cultural voices believe, that they are privileged, right, which is a word that's terribly abused and overused right now, and so they feel guilty, and on the basis of that they need to stop being so ambitious, right? And then people who are guilty are more easily pushed around by people who seem to have a voice of moral authority. And to the extent that those ethical attitudes, right, come to be strong, right, people don't think, I can be an entrepreneur, I can make $1 million, I can take the advantages that were given to me as a native-born American and build on them. If they start to shrink away from that, then we would have big problems.
Would you consider you're associated with ARI, or Ayn Rand Institute?
Actually, Atlas Society.
Atlas Society.
Yeah, that's right.
Mix them up. Do you think that Atlas Shrugged could have been written and popular in anything but an affluent society?
Well, that's an interesting question. But I guess I have to say I don't know. It strikes me that it is a novel that appeals to people all over the world who read it, and they're not necessarily in affluent societies, but I haven't looked at the demographics to say one way or the other.
Because I think about that in terms of something entirely different. What Atlas Shrugged did for me, among other things, is there was this muscular elevation of the achievers and the real producers versus the people that got to stand by and basically pick at the production in different ways. And so it's not lost on you that Parasite won Best Picture. A South Korean movie made at a time in South Korea of enormous abundance. And so it's this movie saying that the poor actually have this seething hatred of the rich. And it strikes me, 50, 60 years ago, South Korea was so incredibly poor, African levels of poverty. Such a movie would have had no relevance, that it's a creation, this anti-rich movie is a creation of the wealth the director and writer disdains. And so I'm always looking for optimism. I feel like there's optimism in some of these cultural things that we're seeing right now.
Yeah, well, I haven't seen that movie, so I can't comment on it specifically. And now I'm getting mixed signals from you. Your first thing says, okay, I should see this movie now.
No, well, you know,
it's says maybe
got
I
Best
shouldn't.
Picture, but
But yes. So you could say that what's going on there is that you just, and this is purely speculative, right? You've got someone who is born in a rich society. He's got some gripes about it, and he's an artistic guy, and as artists want to do, you let your kind of your inner emotions out. And if he's a griping, complaining kind of person, then he's just going to find something to complain about. And no matter what your situation is, how rich or poor your country is, or your society is, or your family is, if you are a complainer, you can find something to complain about. And if you've got some artistic talent, you can portray it. But I sense that probably what's going on here from the reviews that I have read, and I just skimmed a few of them, that this is more of a class warrior ideological. This is a guy who has an agenda, and he just went out looking for data and to tell a story that supports his ideological agenda.
They always say that people dislike politicians broadly, and trust me, this is not a political question as much as they say that people dislike politicians broadly, but when they ask them, well, what do you think about your representative or your senator, they generally have a higher perception of the person near them. And so it leads to my question just about academia more broadly. If you talk to a lot of people in our world, and my own sense is that they overstate it, as they say, oh, these universities, oh, these college campuses, oh, these kids are, in the fetal position, they can't handle new ideas. With you at Rockford University, is that what you notice? Is your perception of where you are different from this blanket perception? What do you see there? Because you are a pretty full-throated promoter of a philosophy that is about individualism. And
well, in one way, my university is in the Midwest part of the country, and there are some pretty radical people who are there, but tends to be that the most extreme strangenesses that happen on university campuses, they start on the coast and they work their way into the middle, but they tend to get moderated by the time they get to the middle. Also, my university, it's a good university. It's not an elite institution, but it's a solid kind of middle of the pack institution. So the students who come to my university, it's also a private university, so they're paying a lot of money there, tend to be students who are Midwestern students. They're serious about education, and so I find among them they are less ideologically weird than you might find on other campuses. That said, and here I try not to be an older curmudgeonly professor type who says, kids these days and so on, but there does seem to be less kind of self-resourcefulness in the last, I would say, 6 years. I have noticed it among students. There's a kind of a down step one level in terms of resourcefulness. Now, where that is coming from, I have speculations, but I don't have hard data. And I'm trying to avoid being too pontificating on this point, because I know it's an age-old professorial thing to say, kids this decade are worse than kids 10 years ago, and so forth. Part of it, I think, is that as professors, they come out of graduate school, you're younger and you're still high idealism, and you kind of project a lot of your enthusiasm for your discipline, and there is a realism that kicks in the more you're a professor, and when you've dealt with hundreds and thousands of students, you get a better sense for where the students actually are. And one of the big wake-up calls always for professors is, we all love our disciplines, and we think it's the most important discipline in the universe, to realize that in fact, not everybody loves your discipline as much as you do, and so students have different motivation levels. So getting a bead on where students are, I think it's hard, and I do think that I wouldn't say that there are any stupider. My students seem to be as smart as any other, and they seem to be as dedicated to getting a college education when they come in. They just don't seem to have that important resourcefulness. And my speculation is that too much has been done for them, either by their parents or by the schools, and so they are less prepared along that one dimension.
But no snowflakes, or that's the word we hear about college kids today.
Yeah.
Do you sense that at Rockford, or is it?
Yeah, I think if by snowflake you mean someone who comes to university and finds it intellectually and emotionally overwhelming and is not ready to handle that, then I think there has been a slight uptick in that. I do think students are a little less prepared. Okay, and the demographic or the numbers that I've seen do seem to bear that out. But I think really the snowflake charge is mostly directed toward intellectual and ideological activists who will be the ones that we see on YouTube making a big fuss about something or other. And there I think it's kind of a faux snowflake pose that they're taking. What they've learned is that particularly Americans and people in Western civilization more broad, but we care very much about issues of racism and sexism, and we feel moderately guilty about the history of various oppressions, and we want the underdog and people who haven't had a chance to really get a chance, and so we really bend over backwards right on all of those dimensions. And what a certain segment of the more power hungry activist types have learned is that they can use that against you, that they can attack you right on those various points, and people will be very touchy and very defensive, and people who are touchy and defensive on those points, you can kind of move the goalposts in a direction that you want. So they will use snowflake tactics, right? Oh, I'm offended, you've hurt me, right? My group is victimized and so forth, but they don't really believe that. They are using it as a power play. So a lot of it is fake.
But do you hear it in your world? Do you hear, oh, well, you would not believe the students at my school. They're awful. Oh, I can't say anything. Or is this, what's your sense? Or is this, again, this Berkeley concept, once again, that it's that 5% that get the publicity, but in fact...
Well, I think on any campus, it's always going to be a minority of students who are doing so. That's true. But I think it is different also, and this is where we need better demographics, if that minority of students is 10% of the population compared to 4% of the population. In both cases, it's a minority, but there's still going to be a major impact difference if it's 10% as opposed to 4%. And we know this from coalition building in any sort of social organization where you need to get a number of people together. There's a critical mass, 1 or 2 people all by themselves in a large group, they're not going to get things done. But if you've got 8 or 10, then even if you're still a relatively small minority, if you are vocal and principled, then you can carry the day.
Now, you're in Washington, D.C., of course, for the Students for Liberty Mid-Atlantic Conference this weekend. What will you be speaking about?
I'm going to be speaking on socialism and its appeal to young people. Socialism is a big tent like any of the other isms, and my special interest is not so much in middle-aged or older socialists, right, or even academic socialists, but all of the data that seems to show when you talk to young people, that's defined as kind of late teens to early 20s, do you find socialism to be preferable to free market capitalism or the various other isms? There's been a big jump just in the last 10 years in the number of students who will respond affirmatively to that. So my question is, what's going on there?
And do you think, what you know so far, is this indicative of a rising collectivist nature on the part of do they not like free markets? I just asked the question because what always fascinates me is we hear this, and I brought up New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco. They so often they go there, but reading in USA Today before I wrote my third book, The End of Work, and that's not a plug for it, but there was a story on hotel brands. And every hotel brand in the world was creating brands to appeal to the Generation Z millennial demographic. They view them as extraordinarily lucrative in the future, which signals a rush away from this. And it also strikes me that market signals are fairly forward-looking. The stock market never prices in the present, it prices in the future. You'd think that if a whole generation of Americans were moving in a collectivist direction, that this would be priced right now as, oh dear, the richest country in the history of the world is about to go in a direction that is anti-wealth, and you don't see it. And so in studying the demographics, is there something we're missing? Is there something the markets are missing? Or do you think since the markets are right?
I don't think so. I think markets are very resilient, and human nature is what it is. So I think a lot of what happens is students will go to college, they might become more radicalized, they might absorb certain more collectivized views, but then they get out and reality hits, and reality hits in a good way. They realize that when they go to work that all business people and so forth are not evil exploiters, that they actually are doing valuable work. And they also realize that they want to have a good living, and so on. So people do change their minds or become more moderated as they go through. Now, I then can't speak to what the market pricings are going on, but I agree with all of your analysis. My area of expertise is what's going on inside the universities, and I think that's important because it still is going to be the case, despite the various crises, economic and technological, that are hitting higher education now, that credentialing is going to carry on for the next generation, and the fact is that most smart young people spend a significant amount of their formative years in universities before they go out into the world. So what philosophy of life, what philosophy of politics, what philosophy of economics they imbibe there in varying degrees and in varying degrees of committedness is important for the next generation.
One last question. What do you think will surprise people the most about your findings? Is there something that, assuming you've given this speech before, or you've given a variation of it, what tends to stand out to people?
No, this is my new talk for this year.
Oh.
Yeah, so at Student for Liberty and Young Americans for Liberty and various organizations, I usually work up one or two new talks for each year. So this is really part of a research project for me, trying to figure out what's going on with the younger generation. And I don't think this generation's socialists, whatever socialism means to them, it doesn't mean old Soviet-style central planning, for most of them. That ship has sailed. So one of the things that those of us who are pro-freedom, typically what happens is someone says that they're in favor of socialism, and we immediately start saying, yes, but what about the Soviet Union? And we expect then that the young person has got an answer to that, but of course they don't know the history. But also it's relevant for them because they genuinely, I don't think, believe that we need to have some sort of authoritarian central planning and dictator. That's not what they are. They are kind of American socialists, whatever that is. Or we start to say, here are all of these charts and data. Don't you know the economic comparatives of free market systems, versus socialist systems and so forth, and all of that just causes younger socialists' eyes to glaze over as well. And I think that's partly because the economics isn't as important for them. Where the money comes from, they know that they're rich, they're just interested in spreading the money around, a little bit more. So they're not motivated to study all of that economics. They didn't come to their socialism through the study of history. They didn't come to their socialism through the study of economics. There's something else that's going on, and that's what I'm interested in.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can't wait to see the talk tomorrow. Have a wonderful week and weekend. I'm your host, John Tamny.